Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. So welcome. Very lovely to see all of you. Always a pleasure. Even though the weather's not great. It's not great. Yeah. But anyway, you're here now, so we all feel much more cheerful than we did. So let's start this evening of celebration by first of all welcoming Professor Julie Froud, who's Professor of Financial Innovation at the Alliance Manchester Business School. Now, Professor Froud works as a team with Karel Williams, who's a professor at Manchester, and over many years now they have been working on something called the foundational economy, which has changed the way we think about the issues of livelihood and livability for households here in the UK, and we'll also talk about a little later on about how it might be relevant to other parts of the world. What's important, I think, about this work is the synergy it has with the work we do here in the IGP. And actually, Professor Williams, who can't be with us this evening, gave one of the very first directed seminars at the IGP when the IGP started. And we followed each other's work and exchanged ideas. And I have to say that the foundational economy has made a profound impact on the way in which a number of academics and policymakers and activists think about how we address challenges in the UK today. So we're incredibly lucky to have Professor Froud with us this evening to talk about it and to talk about how do we get better lives and what do we do about the crisis of household livability. So please welcome her to the IGP.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. Can you all hear me? Yeah, okay, great. So thanks so much for coming along on such a kind of cold, dark night. And I feel a bit apologetic because you're having an evening of celebration and I'm going to talk about crisis and things not working. But, you know, we get maybe a little bit more optimistic towards the end. So I hope it's not too much of a downer on what should be a nice evening. So, I'm going to talk about the idea of household livability. And this is really a sort of follow on from, as Henrietta said, sort of, you know, 10 years or so of research on the idea of the foundational economy. So I want to talk specifically about the idea of a crisis of livability, and then think about, you know, how to make things work better. And here think about the idea of improvement as a sounds very modest, but rather than thinking about transformation, reform, you know, big picture, heroic stuff, thinking about how do we start to do lots of things better and how do we learn from that. So that's really the message. And I think it's relevant in that respect that both Karel and I are both academics, but we're also increasingly involved in sort of working with practitioners, particularly in Wales. So later on, some of the examples I give you are you know, specifically based in Wales, so hopefully they have much broader relevance. So we're both part of an organisation called Foundational Economy Research, which is a sort of action research agency working in Wales, but also outside. And Karel is currently chair of something called the Foundational Alliance Wales, which is all about how to get social innovation in, particularly in housing and care, but in other areas as well. So we're sort of learning a lot by starting to try to do things and working with people who are doing things. So it's the presentation is, the first part is really based on a book we published earlier this year. The second part is definitely work in progress. So I'm really looking forward to getting your comments and ideas on all of this. Okay, so as I said, the first part of the presentation is thinking about the idea of household livability, and in particular, the notion that household livability is in crisis. Okay, now, apologies in some senses, this is very much a UK focused presentation, but I suspect that, you know, there will be a lot of resonances in other parts of the world with at least parts of this. So the illustrations are going to be using UK data, but hopefully, you know, we could have some discussion about those things a little bit later. So I want to think about the idea of household livability through a foundational lens. That's the idea. So the foundational economy, for those of you who haven't come across it, it's a way of thinking about the kind of the overlooked and the kind of rather mundane parts of the economy. But these are the infrastructures, the services, the things that underpin everyday life, and your ability to access these things will have a big impact on the quality of life. And so the foundational economy sort of research sort of frame is interested both in how those systems are provided and what goes wrong, but also in that interface with households. So it's, if you're an economist, I guess you'd say it's the supply side and the demand side. And of course, those things are quite well integrated. So the starting point of the foundation economy approach, in a sense, is different from a kind of mainstream economics approach, because it's not concerned with ideas around how do we get more economic growth, how do we improve productivity, kind of mainstream economic objectives, and is much closer to the idea of, Sen's idea of kind of development. How do you think about, what allows, citizens to have, choices, to be able to live their lives in ways they find valuable. So this is particularly relevant in in the UK when we're coming up to a general election and we're having a lot of kind of economic policy arguments, and these are all very much based around notions of restoring growth. How do we get more growth? How do we grow productivity? How do we make the economy work better? So that's a kind of dominant policy narrative, but in the foundational economy we try to sort of think about this in different ways, and some of that's very pragmatic, because the experience of growth in the UK, as in other places, growth is very uneven. Growth is associated with increasing inequality. If you look at the relative shares of capital and labour, over time you see a large redistribution away from workers to capital. So there's no sense that having more of the same thing is going to make better outcomes for most people. Productivity in an economy that's mainly service-based is a very problematic concept, particularly in a lot of services where labour is both the input and the output. So productivity is just not a very helpful way of thinking about what do we need to do better in our economy. So even if you assume that we could actually develop policies, economic policies that would deliver more growth, which I think is questionable, it's not at all clear that these would produce better outcomes in terms of this whole notion of livability. So instead, we sort of think, the ideas around development are much more helpful in the sense that they have a much broader view about what does it mean for people to have good lives, to be able to make decisions, have those choices, do things that are relevant to them. But also thinking about this in a kind of collectivist frame, because one of the key aspects of the foundational economy is that it's based on a whole series of collectively provided and often collectively consumed infrastructures and services. So this isn't about individuals making choices in a market. This is about individuals being part of collective systems, often which are not failing to work in the same way. So this collective provision is a very important part of the foundational economy. So here's the sort of the way of thinking. So we're interested in the idea, we call it livability. You might come up with other terms. It's not, in a sense, the language isn't the most important thing. It's the way of thinking in some ways. But this is sort of thinking about livability through a foundational economy lens. And our argument is that, there are three things that need to be in place, those things existing within an economy, which are necessary for individuals to be able to have the kind of the freedoms that we might want. So those things are, apologies, it's a very simple diagram, sort of primary school colours, but it's hopefully it makes sense. So these three preconditions, or the three kind of pillars of livability, are of course income, because in a market society you can't live without income. But in particular, we want to reframe this around the notion of residual income. So it's not simply how much money do you earn from your work or from benefits or investment income, but it's how much do you have left after you've paid for essentials. So, if you think about the most common essentials, pretty much everybody needs to pay for housing, energy, food, transportation. There may be other essentials, particularly for some households. If you think about something like care, most households don't need care most of the time, but if you do need childcare or you do need care for adults in your household, this can be incredibly expensive. Okay, so in a sense, the idea of residual income should be related to these essentials that you need to pay for. So, you know, the income that's relevant is not how much do you get from your job or from your pension, but how well are you able to purchase those essentials. Okay, then the second pillar is the essential services, in particular those things that are provided free of charge or at a kind of subsidized rate through these collective systems. So health, education, care, public transport, the things which are, you know, those foundational economy services. And here, you know, the important thing is not simply how much do they cost if they have to be paid for, but their accessibility and their quality. Can you get healthcare? Can you get education, you know, in a place and of a form that's necessary for you? And then the third pillar in the middle is social infrastructure. So this is, I think, seems to be becoming increasingly important in terms of notions of livability, in terms of thinking about the place specificities of livability, is to think about both the hard infrastructures, so kind of places to be, places to do things, and the soft stuff, which is, you know, organized by humans. So, you know, the infrastructure includes, you know, parks, libraries, swimming baths, public spaces where you can take part in formal activities or individual activities, but these are places that are essential because they, you know, they underpin livability as well. So that's the kind of the basic framework, and I'll talk about those things in a minute in terms of why, you know, it's obvious we're in a crisis in relation to all three of those pillars. In a sense, it's not simply that one of those pillars is a little bit weak, but currently we're facing a crisis that affects each of those three pillars in distinctive ways. So one of the other differences in the sort of this foundational framing compared with, you know, a lot of mainstream thinking is the not simply the shift away from GVA or GDP measures, but a shift away from thinking about individuals to thinking about households, a kind of collective units, because, you know, a lot of economic policy is based on an individual who enters a labour market, receives a reward, who then goes and spends their wages on, you know, makes individual consumption choices. Now, obviously, all of that happens, but as individuals, our experience of livability is mediated through a household very often. So if you think about, you know, if you live with other people, you have opportunities to share expenditure. Okay, if you live with other people who have sources of income, you may be able to pool your income. And you know, in the UK, 70% of people live in multi-person households, so they have more opportunities to do that. Now, we're not romantic about households and assume these are you know, a household is necessarily a good place. And obviously, you can get all kinds of bad things happening within households and people treated unequally. But, you know, to sort of abstract away from that, if you think practically within households, it's possible to pool income, share expenditures. And one of the implications is that those people who don't have those opportunities are typically much worse off in a society like the UK. So, for example, the chart here divides UK households into deciles by gross income. Okay, so decile 1 on the left is the lowest 10% of households, on the right it's the highest 10% of households, and then the coloured bars are telling you how many people, you know, who are notionally economically active are in that household. So on the red is nobody. So if you look at the poorest 20%, D1 and D2, you're looking at more than 70% of those households have nobody who is, you know, earning an income. Okay, and then as you go along the chart, you can see the red area gets smaller, and then you get a larger percentage in the blue part, which is 1 earner, and then green is 2 earners, and then the yellow is 3, and purple is 4. And you can see, you know, there's a very clear association between, you know, who lives in your household, how many people are in the household who could be a source of income, and the gross income of that household. Okay, so it's not to say, you know, there aren't lots of complexities within this, but broadly, you know, if you live on your own, particularly if you live on your own with children, you are much more likely to be in that lower part of the income distribution. And that's a very sort of stark reminder, you know, it matters who you live with, you know, in these financial terms. So, you know, having no earner, having one earner is a good predictor of being, you know, in the lower half of the income distribution. Equally, if you have at least two earners, you're more likely to be in the higher group. So that's a kind of reality. So this is why we kind of think about households, because, you know, livability is partly shaped by households, and also households are physically located in places, you know, often, you know, difficult to move. So where you live is also going to affect your access to public services, social infrastructure, employment, all of those kinds of things. So the household is a nice notion because it's a literal thing, but also it's a kind of, you know, it's a grounded thing as well. So we think this is a helpful way to think about livability. Okay, so if we think about, that's a sort of generic way of thinking about livability. If we think about the UK at the moment, then, you know, the sort of public debate is very much around this crisis of, you know, everything is broken, nothing works, lots of books coming out with similar titles, lots of sort of opinion polls like the one here. So this is from May this year, and this is an opinion poll. 3 questions highlighted. The first question is, nothing works in Britain anymore, and 58% agree, only 17% disagree. The second question, the social contract in Britain is broken, which is quite an interesting framing for a question. 62% agree, only 8% disagree. Some people, you know, presumably aren't too sure. And third question, things in Britain are worse now than they were in the past. Now, obviously, it's not a great question from a research point of view, but as an opinion poll, it's giving you a sense of you know, a feeling. And that's 76% agree and only 8% disagree. So, you know, there's something here that people are feeling something. Now, of course, this is, you know, in a sense, it's not very helpful because, you know, the idea that nothing works is much too absolute. But you can see this kind of poll is tapping into this sense that, you know, there is a kind of crisis and things don't work, whether it's trains or schools falling down or access to a dentist or a whole series of different things that people get very frustrated about. Okay, so I want to sort of think about that nothing works idea and come back to the 3 pillars and sort of think about what do we see in a UK context in relation to those 3 pillars at the moment. You know, why is it that there seems to be this notion of a crisis? Okay, so the first pillar then was this idea about income, and as I said, in particular, the notion of residual income. So the residual is kind of what's left. So on the graph here shows the residual of income after the cost of 4 foundational economy essential services, so housing, energy, food, and transport. And the chart again divides households into tenths according to income. So what the chart is showing you is the blue part is how much does a household in each of those groups spend on those 4 essentials. The yellow part is the residual, so that's what you've got left to spend on everything else. And the red part is the percentage that you're spending on those 4 things. And if I hadn't showed you that but asked you to draw it, you'd probably come up with something like this. It's not, you know, it's not really a surprise in terms of lower income households spend a much larger proportion of their income on just these 4 essentials, and lower income households have a much smaller discretionary spend. If you look in the bottom half, you can see that the absolute spend doesn't increase very steeply. You know, there's a kind of minimum cost to a household of existing, you know, and, you know, your that cost doesn't increase terribly rapidly, but you can see that the discretionary part does go up, you know, quite quickly, particularly once you get into the middle. So in some senses, this kind of current cost of living crisis that's a big, you know, political and social concern in the UK is a cost particularly related to those 4 essentials. So we've had, you know, the energy crisis with household energy bills in the UK pretty much doubling and still very high. Now we have food price inflation, something it's very unfamiliar in the UK, this notion of inflation, but food price inflation being particularly high and quite persistent. And And what that means is this data is from 2021. So this is before that inflation is hitting. Okay, so you're seeing this is what households were spending before energy prices doubled, before food prices increasing by, on average, about 19%. Obviously some foods have gone up a lot more than that. So what you're seeing is, how much scope is there for households to kind of be able to afford much higher costs of essentials. Only the 40% of households who are in the top 40% of the income distribution have a kind of comfortable margin of discretionary spend. And if we switched from income to savings, most of these households effectively have no savings. That's the consequence of not having a lot of discretionary income, is you can't save. So you neither have the current income nor the savings to help you manage price increases. Okay, and now so far transport, energy and food costs have gone up a lot, and that what we're seeing now is the impact on housing, which of course is the largest of those four costs for many households. So increasing interest rates are going to hit the 30% of UK households with mortgages, and also the smaller number in private rented accommodation. So we're seeing the housing crisis is kind of only adding to this problem about residual income. And of course, lots of households having to make very different choices about how they manage to survive with these costs. So there's clearly a real crisis in terms of residual income. If we look at the essential services, what I'm showing here is household income from different sources. The red bars are income from wages and other sources. So if you have savings and earned interest, that would be counted there. The green parts, which are quite small, that's cash benefits. So that's social security, state pension. The blue part is benefits in kind. So that's calculated by UK Statistical Agency, and that's the value to the household of those services provided either at a free or subsidised rate. So public schooling, public healthcare, concessionary travel passes, and a whole series of other things. Those are really the big things, and care as well. So it's interesting, if you look at, again, the lower income households, you can see that the benefits in kind are, for the poorest 10%, the value of benefits in kind is more than the value of earned income. The benefits in kind are almost as large as earned income in the second 10%. So what this is telling us is that not only are those, free or highly subsidized services very important to low-income households, but if they had to start paying more to access those things, it simply wouldn't be feasible. Now, this is an important question in the UK because we've got accumulating problems around healthcare, so long waiting lists, increasing incidence of people opting for private medicine. So in the UK now, out-of-pocket private medical costs are as high as in the US. Now, that's not an entirely fair comparison because in the US, lots of people are on private medical schemes, as are some people in the UK. But you're seeing rapidly rising incidence of people in the UK who have access to a national health service paying for private medicine, to see a doctor, to pay for operations. And it's the same thing that we've seen for some time around dentistry, a lack of public dentistry, which is highly subsidized, is forcing more and more people to pay for dentistry. Now, that's fine if you're in the upper bit of the income distribution, but for lower income households, you can see the equivalent cost of those things when provided in a very efficient public sector basis is not something that you could afford to do at a much higher private sector rates. Or if you look at public transport, at the same time as the density of the bus network has been shrinking, bus fares have gone up much more than the cost of private motoring over the last 15 years. And again, the withdrawal of bus services, particularly outside London, bus services have been really hit. And that, of course, is affecting lower income households disproportionately, which makes them more dependent on local labour markets. If they have, if they don't have enough cars for the number of people who need to travel. So the problem with public services is that you can see this is a crisis that's getting worse, and the ability of households to buy their way out of the crisis is very uneven. You know, higher income households can pay for private dentistry, private health, can buy another car. Lower income households can't. So you're seeing, you know, those inequalities becoming worse. Okay, then social infrastructure. So with social infrastructure, this is not always provided by local authorities, by local government, but a lot of the hard stuff comes from local authorities, so park maintenance, public swimming pools, libraries, and so on. I mean, these are services that you know you can't put on a market because they simply don't pay their way. Large scale cuts in the budgets of local authorities since 2010. So you can see, for example, if you look at cultural and related services, more than 50% real terms cut in that budget from 2010 to 2023. So that's the budget which provides, you know, social infrastructure, provides grants to local groups who want to do things, youth clubs, all that kind of stuff. So you're seeing that social infrastructure is really at the hard end of cuts. Of course, again, if you're a higher income household, you can go to a private gym, you can drive your car and go to somewhere nice to take a walk. You can afford to buy a book rather than go to a library. So again, the kind of the weakening of the pillars is having a very unequal effect. And studies like those by Local Trust and Joseph Rowntree show that the most deprived areas have the least social infrastructure. So it's worse already in those places. Okay, so that's the kind of the depressing bit. You know, things are in a mess. And so the question is, how do we think about the idea of livability and start to say, well, how would you improve some of these things? What are the ways of thinking about how do you tackle those three pillars? And of course, you might want different things for each of those pillars, and you might want different things in different places. But what I want to do is think about action at different levels. So think about sort of, you know, top-down government, bottom-up community-led action, and then the stuff in the middle, the kind of intermediaries who I think are particularly interesting and probably have not done nearly as much as they could or should do in this respect. So first thing is, it's, you know, if you start to think about how would you improve livability, how would you start to do things that made one or more of those pillars better? You know, it's kind of the Escher staircases is quite nice because you might appear to be going up and then perhaps you're not going up, and you've got things in different directions, and the whole thing is incoherent. It's hard to know the situation we're in. Lots of people, lots of organizations are trying to do things, different levels. Government tries to do things, local authorities, charities, people try to do things, but the net result is, you know, is a lack of kind of sort of a clear sense of coherent effort. And the problem is, of course, that action at different levels is always problematic. We probably expect a lot of government still. You know, we perhaps expect less of communities, but we may have unrealistic views about what communities are able to do. And then you've got, as I said, you've got these intermediary level organizations in the middle who perhaps, you know, have not been doing as much as they could, and could, you know, in working through alliances in cooperation, could be doing a lot more. So that's what I want to look at in the second part of the presentation. So thinking about improvement, you know, we can use the idea of social innovation to help us. So, you know, normal economic innovation, you know, inventing things, doing things differently, you know, there's usually a financial incentive because it may involve reducing your costs or opening up new markets. You know, so if you have economic innovation, it normally takes care of itself in that, you know, governments will support it, private companies, investors will invest in it, and it sort of happens. The problem about social innovation is up trying to work out, you know, what are the key things that work, and then how do you do more of them? How do you kind of learn from them? How do you ensure that there's the financial support to allow those things to continue? So social innovation is experimental. Again, if you think of the point about households, is they're located in places are different. You know, the same things won't necessarily work in one place as in another place. So, you know, there's a huge need for kind of learning and experimentation in order to figure out how do you act on livability to start making things better in all kinds of ways. And I think from the sort of the kinds of innovations we've been looking at over the last few years, are sort of trying to get some view about, what the preconditions might be for, livability focused social innovation. And I'd be interested to see whether you would agree or disagree. But think about the first thing is the idea. What are you going to do? So some organizations, some actors have a lot of ideas about what could be done. Okay, other organizations with resources often don't have very good ideas. So an actionable idea, resources, you need finance. I come from a business school, so the idea of a business model is really important. You need something that works in operating terms, but you also need to be able to finance your capital. So this is really a big issue, is how do you actually make it work, not simply day to day, but how do you fund the investment that you might need for that action? You need management capability, because a lot of things are very marginal in terms of, whether they're financially viable. And we'll show some examples in a minute. So you've got to be able to manage processes and costs in particular very effectively. Otherwise, things simply don't work in an environment where there's a lot of financial constraint. And the fourth thing is the accountability. So in a sense, how do you know you're actually doing things that people want? How are you doing things with people? How are you accountable for the things that you do? And so those are kind of four quite important things, and being able to achieve all of them is quite difficult. Think about actors at different levels. They can all do some of that. Being able to do all four things is pretty hard, and that's why alliances seem to be quite an important way of thinking. Is how do you work with others who have some of the things that you don't have? Okay, so think about top-down government. Maybe government increasingly has kind of quite big ideas, but perhaps rather disconnected from the problems that we might like governments to solve. So governments often struggle with robust ideas. The things governments want to do often don't really connect with the very tangible livability problems, and very often struggle with accountability. Government is very remote, and sometimes even the third one, of capability. Many cases where governments public agencies don't seem to be able to do things very well, often quite expensive, not very effective. So the mainstream ideas about, well, we just grow the economy, then people will have more wages, and then people will pay more tax, and then public services can be better funded. This is the sort of in that delusional idea category, I think, in a UK context, because it's hard to see how you get growth going. And if you get growth going, it's hard to see how you do any more than worse than income inequalities and climate emergency and all of those other things. So in a sense, if we step away from that and think about how might we do things differently. Or again, public service reform is a preoccupation of governments, this idea that it must be possible to do things more efficiently, to reorganize yet again, or to bring in either private finance or private risk management or private organization. All of these experiments usually turn out to have very mixed outcomes. Okay, and this again is not specifically a UK issue, but the kind of the urge to just reform public services and make them work better, again, doesn't seem to be something that's going to address livability problems. And you're dealing with entities in central, devolved and local government in the UK where a lot of years of underfunding has hollowed out capacity. So it's a difficult position to start with. So from a sort of top-down government perspective, thinking about what the relevant frameworks are, how could we make changes to those frameworks that would support livability? So thinking about, for citizens in particular, the social security system in the UK is increasingly becoming much more targeted on work. The idea that, you should really, everybody really should be working, and therefore benefits for those who are unable to work are increasingly very low. So, the poorest households are those who are most dependent upon benefits. So benefit levels for those who don't work are low. Marginal tax rates for those who are shifting increasingly from benefits to work are exceedingly high, more than 70% marginal tax rates. The system doesn't work very well. Clearly you could very easily make a lot of changes to that benefit system to make it a more generous system for those people who have the lowest financial resources. If we think about how to fund public services in more accountable ways, then, you know, old-fashioned ideas of social insurance, pooling risks, all of these things remain very good, you know, important ideas, particularly around areas like social care, which is expensive for individuals if they have to bear the cost themselves. And then thinking about how do we fix some of the physical infrastructures, water, energy, which are incredibly expensive, particularly when they've been underinvested for so long. So we need to think, you know, more creatively about wealth taxes as well as income taxes. And we need better data. One thing that's quite evident is during the pandemic and then the energy crisis, when governments have spent a lot of money trying to support households, is how badly targeted a lot of that is, because there isn't simply the right kind of data on households. So, you know, in a sense, the money has not been used in the most effective way to support the households who needed the most help. So there's a data question. Okay, so we move from top down to bottom up. What you have with, you know, community organizations is you get that tick, generally local accountability. That's the thing that they do very well. Good ideas, because the ideas are coming out of local problems that people understand, but much more problem about the financial resources. How do you get something to work? And the management capability, often when this is dependent upon volunteers and a lot of kind of, you know, unpaid labor. So local ownership, local control, there's a lots of sort of, you know, nice, warm sort of ideas around this. You know, the problem, of course, is there's many more community assets than there is funding to buy these. So there's lots of, you know, lots of schemes, but, you know, they make very limited dents. But you can see good things. So, you know, for the Welsh example, this is a hotel in Snowdonia called the Penguin. This was bought by the community and reopened after it had closed in 2011. You know, it's been a very successful local asset, but entirely dependent upon grants, a series of grants to kind of help make the purchase possible and then to do the works that are needed to improve it. So, you know, it's an incredibly valuable community asset, but the problem is it needs more money spending on it, and it doesn't have that business model. You know, it operates fine as a community pub with some simple rooms, but if you want to do more than that, if you want to convert the derelict part into a bunkhouse, it's in beautiful walking territory. There's lots of people who want accommodation. Then the problem is, you know, you need to access finance, you need to take risks. It becomes much more difficult to manage all of those kinds of things. So how do we think about the reset? That's from the bottom up, thinking about how you can get community organizations networking between themselves and sharing some of those resources. So that hotel is actually part of a kind of network of social enterprises called Cwmni Bro Festiniog, and collectively they're currently employing more than 100. They've got things like a mountain bike trail in the old slate quarries. They've got a hotel for people with disabilities and their carers. They've got cafes. They've got a variety of enterprises. And what they're trying to do is kind of share resource, financial resources, human resources, actually collaborate with each other and think about what else they could do to try to build up more financial resources that might allow them then to invest in, you know, the local high street, which is full of empty buildings and things. But it's a really big challenge. It requires a huge amount of effort, resource, and so on. And there's a lot of limits on what they can do. So, you know, social enterprises can do a lot, but, you know, borrowing money, being exposed to kind of risky market-based activities is not sensible. There's a risk that they can lose a lot. You know, in a sense, private companies might take different kinds of options. So, you know, they're individually, they have a lot of constraints. You know, joining together, they're starting to learn how to do lots of more things collectively, but there are still going to be limits on what they can do as a group of social enterprises. So the middle level then, this is, I think, is the interesting level, because it's the one that's kind of not talked about so much. You know, lots of stuff on government, lots of stuff on kind of community organizations. But at the intermediate level, you've got organizations which are sometimes described as anchors. or grounded because they, they're not going anywhere. The local hospital, the further education college, university, heaven forbid, housing associations, providers of social housing, local authorities, they're there, they're serving groups of people, whether it's tenants, whether it's residents, whether it's patients. And I think they're an important resource because they do have capacity, they have finances, some of them can borrow, not all of them, but some of them can borrow. They do have management capabilities. They often have weak connections to community, so they're missing that fourth thing. Sometimes they have good ideas, not always, but they've got some of those lemons, and some of them increasingly are sort of going beyond this sense, we're an anchor, we're in our community, but like, universities all have this kind of narrative about, we're responsible members of our local community. That's a kind of anchor narrative. A driver narrative is much more actually, we're going to start doing things. We're going to do more creative things. We're going to not do the same things as everybody else. So an example would be lots of local organisations are very hung up on local purchasing, like health or colleges, but most of their budgets are actually employing people. The amount of purchasing is quite small, and the scope for local purchasing is generally quite limited. But this is a big sort of thing they talk a lot about. So how do you move beyond, a little bit of local purchasing to thinking about your workforce? So there's some interesting things going on some of the Welsh health boards where they're looking at how do you recruit local people and give them careers. So you recruit people without qualifications, get them jobs as care assistants, and if they want to, put them on training routes so that they can over time become registered nurses. Okay, and this is obviously very, very relevant in a society which has a shortage of people in health and care professions, but it's about saying, how do we use our workforce spend, which is most of our outgoings, to actually connect with the local community, make a difference to, local households through, that income pillar to some extent, but also through the other things as well. So how do you think about doing things in different ways, whether it's hospitals, whether it's housing associations looking at setting up kitchens to produce meals for people of different types? There's lots of interesting things going on. In terms of financial viability, they're just about possible. So, for example, 2 local authorities in Wales are reforming their home care away from the not very effective time-based systems into kind of patch systems, even at the very low rates that local authorities currently pay. It's just about possible. It's not great, but that's where that management capability comes in. You've got to have a very, very tight control in order to make things work. So those actors are potentially very important, particularly if they work with others, because they don't have all the lemons. But if you can get them working with communities, and you get them working with government as well, you've got more chance of putting together things at different levels. So there's lots of potential. Most of those intermediaries currently aren't doing very much. So in Wales, which is where most of this work, there's a small number of housing associations which are genuinely doing very interesting things. Most of them are not. There's a small number of local authorities reforming their health, their domiciliary care, and most of them are not. So the challenge is how do you motivate more of the others to take some risks, to try some different things, to find out what others are doing? How do you build alliances, between organisations who sometimes might see themselves as competing, even though they're not-for-profit organisations? And one nice example of that is something called Movement 2025, which is a movement in North Wales, which is aiming to reduce, health inequalities. So the kind of health inequalities that arise because people, have low incomes, live in places lacking opportunities and facilities. And that is bringing together health organisations, housing organisations, local government around particular projects. So say, okay, if we do things together and we target things, can we actually make differences? And what they're finding is they can. But of course, in the big picture, all these things are quite small. So, for a real programme of improvement, how do you just do more of these things at a much greater scale? And how do you make sure that, you know, as you scale up, you don't lose the citizen involvement, the co-production and all of those things. So, you know, there are lots of challenges here, but it seems to be there are lots of things that are possible. So to finish, I don't have a kind of, you know, I said the second half is more optimistic than the first half. I don't have a kind of big reveal where I can say to you, here's the answer, but I think there are things here, even in a very constrained system, when you can't expect central government to do much, where local government has very limited resources, there are still things here that have been done that could be done more. You know, a lot of, you know, the frameworks around social housing, around rent controls, local authority funding, these are more constraints. They could be helpful. At the moment, they're kind of squeezing everything, you know, they're constraints. But how can you get organizations sort of working inside their circles? How can you, you know, build on the kind of demonstration effect, you know, things working? You know, government is not a leader, but government may be persuaded to be a follower if you can show them things. How do you kind of raise the profile of experimentation and value some of those things better? And how do you sort of formulate the asks? You know, what do you want to ask central government to do? How are you going to make that case? So I think there's interesting ideas here about, you know, routes, pathways to, you know, this boring thing that sounds like improvements. As I said, it's not about transformation. We're not living in a context where you can say, let's transform things. But I think we are in a context where you can say, let's improve things, let's improve livability and make a difference. So let's stop there.
Oh, wonderful, Julie, thank you very much. So let's think about this then in terms of some of the things that we've been thinking about in the IGP. So, Julie, if I could start by asking a very basic question. So when we look at all these challenges that we have in the UK, one of the things that we're very struck by is that although we know that trickle down hasn't worked for the last 60 years, when we try to think about the difference between, say, the Conservative Party and the Labour Party on this, there actually is no difference, right? Now, so the Labour Party is not an alternative to what's happening. They're just, and in fact, Rachel Reeves has just recently come out with regard to the benefits that people are paid in lower income households, saying that she would put further constraints on the relationship of people's ability to either claim work-related benefits or disability benefits, because we now have certain sections of the UK where more than a quarter of working age adults are not working, nor are they seeking any work. So how do you think we've got ourselves into this situation where we don't seem to be able to imagine an alternative? So this is what you've been trying to do. Why can we not shift that debate, do you think?
I don't know. It's a good question. I think the kind of the dominance of kind of mainstream economic thinking, the advisors, the kind of the technocrats, everybody sort of is speaking the same language, has the same ideas. There isn't that kind of diversity of ideas which you would need to basically, and that honesty to say, actually, you know, growth, as you said, growth hasn't really worked in the past for most people. You know, the UK economy has not grown since 2008. Growth in any sense is a bad thing because, you know, the Guardian had some nice stuff a couple of weeks back about, you know, the kind of, you know, emissions relation to income, and it's the middle classes, you know, the ones who've done relatively well, who create the most carbon emissions. So there's all kinds of arguments to say, you know, we don't want to go back to this place that we might have been in. So I think it's a sort of the lack of diversity of ideas and maybe a lack of confidence. In a sense, it's easier to say the same things as everybody else rather than say, actually, let's take a risk and start to say, maybe we're not going to worry about growth, but we'll think about how do we fix housing for people. Yes. So I think that's really the kind of the shift in the livability, is to say, forget that big stuff, because you probably can't do it anyway, and we don't think it's going to solve the problems, but why not take a more direct route? Instead of going through this tortuous route of increased living standards, let's say, okay, why not just directly fix the things like housing or public transport or childcare that we know would actually make a difference to people's lives.
Yes. And what's very interesting about taking a different approach is that if we take housing, for example, I mean, look, some of the work we've done
suggests that if you actually focused in local areas on getting your housing to net zero, so doing all the work that's necessary to do that, so you're decarbonising and you're also making all those houses net zero, that actually not only will you create more employment, but you also create better circumstances for people, because as those houses become net zero, then you're not paying as much on fuel, you're not paying as much on costs and so on. And so I think housing is the route in. So have you done anything on, you and Karel, done any more on housing?
We're working with some housing providers, some in the northeast of England and some in Wales, because I think, you know, they, in a sense, the social housing providers are the ones who are leading on the retrofit, because in a sense they need to decarbonise their stock and they have a responsibility, and also they're trying to develop kind of methods for doing it. And it's quite likely in Wales, Welsh government is thinking about, you know, in a sense, getting social housing providers to actually then start to help out with the private sector, which is a disaster in terms of quality and all of those things. So I think housing is a really important one, because if you could only fix housing, as you say, that would make such a big difference to the lives of many people in terms of, you know, the quality of the housing. It's warm, it's comfortable, it's, you know, it de-stresses people, you know, and, you know, gives them a little bit more residual income perhaps. So I think housing is the key one. I mean, again, in sort of mainstream policy terms, it's not seen as all that important, because we're sort of hung up on this kind of everybody should own their own house kind of stuff, and that's sort of seen as being the aim. You know, home ownership is this sort of political target, whereas, you know, the quality of housing, you know, its accessibility. But I think I would say housing is definitely the one to go on, because, you know, housing, you know, I know housing associations are very, very mixed, and some of them are awful. But, you know, potentially they, you know, there are some good ones, and they, you know, they have balance sheets, they can borrow, you know, they're quite important sort of actors, because they can do things that other actors can't do. They have management, they can, you know, they can take charge of retrofit, they can develop workforce skills. So, you know, I think in the Welsh government is trying to coordinate some of this, because they recognise that there are those immediate benefits, as well as, you know, well, it's probably going to create jobs and things as well.
Going on then to thinking about the very important point you made, which is who's going to take the action, or who should be acting, and in what way should they be acting. So the Welsh government is exceptionally interesting because it's very, very innovative. And some people have suggested that that's because Wales is a very small nation. I mean, do you think that's true, that somehow it's because it looks more manageable, or they just have more focus?
Yeah, well, I think because, I mean, they appear innovative in some respects. So they have this piece of landmark legislation called the Wellbeing of Future Generations, and the first country in the world that has a kind of legal responsibility to require public bodies to take into account future well-being. So it's absolutely great. You know, it looks wonderful, but in practice, it's not clear how much difference it's making. It creates a lot of bureaucracy and actions and reports and committees, but it's not yet working probably in the way it needs to. But it's a start, and I think there are progressive things around, you know, not quite a return to kind of corporatism with trade unions being much more involved, but they're much more accepting of the importance of trade unions for, again, securing, you know, better working conditions, which, you know, is a big thing. So I think it's having a devolved authority is important. Having a cultural identity is quite important. It's a small country, but it's also geographically quite a difficult country, and within Wales there's a lot of discontent about people who live in the north and then them in Cardiff. It's a bit like sort of London and the north of England in a sense. You know, I guess you never get it right. But I think you do see interesting things, and in Scotland as well, you see, you know, that it's never perfect, but it's possible to be more imaginative if you've got some political and financial resource.
But it also raises the interesting question of what is the role of government, and what is the role of government specifically in relation to things like regulation. So, for example, when we think about the success that we've had with the renewable energy market in the UK, part of that was the fact that the government legislated and put in place regulation. So they didn't just say, okay, you can all come and be in this new market and you can all make lots of money out of it. That isn't how they did it. And they also directed investment through particular mechanisms. And so presumably there is still some role here for top level of government in making this meso level function better?
Absolutely. I think, you know, on things like, you know, improving, you know, the rights of renters.
Yes.
You know, there's a whole load of things you could do on frameworks for funding social housing. I mean, all the things that are currently constraining livability,
Yeah.
you know, can be fixed through regulation. You know, employment rights, you know, trade union rights, all the things that are being eroded. And these are all, you know, generally progressive things. So regulation is, you know, if things would be a lot easier if you could change some of those regulatory frameworks. Definitely.
Yes, no, I think that's a very important part of it. So let's open up then. Have we got questions from the floor? Yes. Okay, that's fine. So be concise. Okay.
Okay,
Please be concise. Okay. And then we'll.
Hello, yeah, okay. So I have a few, but I will just like ask the first one, because I think that's the most like politically important. Touching upon the ones that you made about like Labour and Conservative, there's a lot of like conversation going on about the general elections and how the local elections are kind of, you know, showing what is going to happen. But when we look at, you know, how much Labour gained seats in local elections and how much, for instance, Lib Dem did, there's not a lot of difference. And Conservative lost a lot, yes. But, well, as we said, Labour, like new Labour and Conservatives are very different when it comes to livability. So what do you think the role of Lib Dems will be, specifically when also Lib Dems said that they're not looking for a coalition between Labour and Lib Dems?
That's a very niche question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, if you're a third party, you have quite a lot of luxury because no one thinks you're going to get in, and therefore you have a much more ability to have to be creative and propose things. So, you know, in a sense, I would like to see the Lib Dems actually coming up with a lot more progressive policy, because it then challenges the two other parties to say, you know, around you know, tenants' rights or workers' rights or environmental rights or any of those things. You know, there's so many areas we could go on. So I think that, you know, that would be, you know, a progressive in a sense if they could actually say, well, let's, you know, we're not going to go down the same jobs growth productivity route, but actually focus on, you know, how do you improve housing, how do you make dentistry accessible to everybody who currently can't afford a private dentist, you know, things that are incredibly important.
Do you reckon that will happen though?
I don't know.
No, well, I think with a genuine lack of imagination almost everywhere. So
Yes.
just here on the left and then at the back, please. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Really got a lot from the presentation, really insightful. Thank you. My question, I think, is around how you and Karel and the Foundation of Economies Collective are working through the different institutional spaces that you've opened up, like, you know, how you're using the space and the opportunities of the university, but also with the new, as I understand it, the Foundation of Economies Action Research, you know, separate, I think it's a community interest company, but I'm really interested there, the opportunities you see to kind of, you know, support some of this intermediary experimentation and push actors into the sorts of collaborations and alliances that you're suggesting are possible, and, you know, the routes you have, you know, through those institutions to drive the kind of broader change that you're laying out.
So it's a nice question. I think it's quite interesting as an academic, because, you know, in a sense, how do you as an academic kind of try to do something meaningful when the general kind of academic objectives on, you know, I'm sure it's the same in UCL as it is in Manchester, in terms of the kinds of journals we should be publishing in and the kinds of things which are deemed by our peers to be the most important are completely different from this kind of engaging, you know, the kind of talking to communities, talking to kind of intermediaries. It's very time consuming. It's not clear what's going to come out of it. You know, I mean, it's always very interesting, but it's not very you know, it doesn't really fit with the main, you know, increasingly the way that the mainstream academic career is going. I think, having said that, the kind of the agenda around impact has been very helpful, because in a sense, having, you know, the kind of the fact that impact is increasingly recognised as something that academics, you know, can do that's valuable, that does open up a really helpful space for doing all manner of things where it's not clear what's going to happen. You know, so I'd say this kind of work is time consuming because it's about, you know, spending time getting to know people, building trust, trying to understand how things work. And then, you know, but there is a lot of interest. I think there are very many people in housing, in health, in community organisations who really want to do more, and, you know, appreciate having sort of academic friends in this. But it's not a straightforward thing to do. You know, if you write a paper or apply for a grant, you kind of know roughly what you should do, even if you're not always successful. But with this kind of work, you know, where do you start? Who do you talk to? How do you avoid wasting lots of time? How do you make yourself, how do you contribute something that others can't contribute? So I think sort of, you know, the ideas are sometimes quite helpful, because talking about livability, doing that a lot in the last few months, people, you know, in health and housing organisations, they say yes, exactly, that's it. You know, it makes sense to them. We're not telling them anything very original. I mean, our pillars of livability is not, you know, it's not anything original at all, but it's organising things in a way that actually is helpful for people who are trying to do things, and then, you know, sort of working with them and making connections. One of the things we want to do is write up some of these kind of cases of sort of social innovation, because they're very much done in little silos, often with limited amounts of funding. So people do something, and then it's always the tragedy of voluntary action and other things, people move on. So trying to capture some of that, I think, is a really important thing for academics to do, and then share it, and then, you know, not in a romantic way, but in a very pragmatic way. So I think that's quite an important thing to do.
Yes, but I think the issue though of social innovation is huge, because we don't have the social institutions we currently need to bring about the improvements you would like to see. So clearly universities have to change what they're doing. I mean, that's both what's happening in the Foundational Economy Collective, and it's also what's happening, excuse me, here in the IGP. So this is a very interesting, I think, space to explore further. So we have a question at the back.
Thank you very much. At a time when livability has become a very difficult thing among many households in the United Kingdom, I would like to know whether government has in place some socioeconomic and legal frameworks in order to cushion the impact of the livability challenges. That is, are there frameworks that will be able to, that have been laid in place to help ordinary people, common people, cope with the challenges?
Yeah, it's an important question, I think. I think governments do things like, you know, with the energy price rise, you know, governments in the UK and lots of other countries kind of threw a lot of money at the problem, but not always in a very effective way. So the households who needed the most help probably didn't get enough, and lots of households could have managed much higher energy prices, but were supported. So I think that, you know, that help gets tied up with kind of politics. You know, energy price rises, the need to be seen, you know, to do something. But I think that there's a lack of coherence, there's a lack of a big picture, and I think some of that is due to not having the right kinds of data. I think, you know, we have a lot of statistics, but, you know, whether we have the ability to kind of get the right bits of information to the right people in a timely way. I think also some of it is about how you view the problem, you know, as Henrietta was saying, if you in a sense you sort of have a mindset that says actually people can sort their own problems out if they get a job, if they get a better job, in a sense that there's still this kind of tendency that in a sense people can, you know, take control of their destiny through a labour market route, even though we know lots of jobs are badly paid and lots of jobs are insecure and lots of people struggle with jobs. So I think that's one of the problems, that kind of gets in the way with this sort of bigger collective view about how, you know, how in a sense all of these things add up. I mean, you see bits of it. I mean, the whole levelling up agenda, in a sense, recognised the importance of place and people valuing where they live, but it wasn't connected to any systematic programme of funding and support. So you see, as with household energy support, you know, levelling up is, you know, is identifying something, but it's not a kind of long-lasting kind of comprehensive approach. You know, it's a bit of money here and a bit of money there, and then that's it. we've moved on.
Yes, I think that's very important because it's basically a sticking plaster kind of policy, because there is a difference between saying the purpose of the government is to improve the quality of people's lives, compared to saying the purpose of the government is to ensure renewed growth, especially when you haven't had any renewed growth and you're not very likely to anytime soon. And so you can't address livability with a comprehensive framework if you're not trying to.
No, absolutely.
You know, it's impossible to go to the north of England if you're driving to the south. And it's just, I mean, all of it, how it is. We have a question here. You go after, we have one here.
Thank you so much for the very interesting presentation. I was wondering how you see the role of private enterprises in the whole foundational economy, and yeah, if they could contribute in any way.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously, most of the economy in the UK, as in other places, is private enterprise, and lots of the foundational economy in food and utilities is private. So there's a lot could be done. I mean, you can think about it at the level of employment conditions, clearly creating better jobs, valuing the role of trade unions, because one of the key things is that over time that, reduction in the amount of national income, when it has grown, less of it's gone to labour. So it's a private actors are very important at that level. Most firms in the UK, as in other economies, are small firms, not large ones. And I think there you do see potential for private enterprise who are kind of connected to communities to do a lot more. I think there's a lot of possibilities which I think again private actors are often not part of the conversations, but they could be. I mean, they are an important resource. So I think if you think about private firms in construction and lots of other sort of place specific things, I think they could be doing a lot more in terms of their workforce, their relations with local communities, and those kinds of things. I mean, of course, there's some parts of the foundation economy where there's a real problem about private motives, think about water and stuff, it doesn't, in a sense, where do you start in that case? But I think there's a lot of other areas of the private sector where you have people who have an interest in local communities and could be persuaded to be part of a progressive alliance.
Don't they, then isn't there just always the conflict of interest between the free market and then raising like costs to increase livability?
Not necessarily, because if you're looking at, say, if you look at a typical private enterprise in the UK is a small firm, not a global corporation. I mean, most of the economy is comprised of small enterprises, and they are much more connected to the places where they're based and the people they recruit. And in a sense, they often people might come from those places themselves and feel a connection. So I think in that sense, okay, ultimately, if you pay your staff more, then potentially there's less profit. But I think it's not quite as simple as that, because you may improve your retention. You may, you may find that your staff are more willing to kind of, to be trained, take other roles on. So I think there's quite a lot of scope to think about, the private sector, in a sense, is a very, very diverse thing. I think, there are firms that I think feel that they could be doing more, but perhaps don't necessarily recognise what they could do. I mean, I don't think you can necessarily bring the whole of the private sector with you on the agenda, but I think that particularly smaller businesses, I think, have that grounded in community attitude. Certainly have come across examples where actually they do recognise that it's their motives are not simply how much can we make. They're trying to build something. They have an interest in their staff, the place where their staff live. So I think there is scope.
Questions, right? Okay, so are you ready yet? No. So Chris, then first, and then back to you. Right. So.
Thanks. I wanted to ask two quick questions. The first was about the household data that we don't have. Could you elaborate on what we could have or what you'd like to see more of? And the second was, what green shoots do you see when looking beyond the UK?
Okay. Yes, so the household income data doesn't have all of the things that we might want. I mean, there is some data, and obviously we presented data, but a lot of it is expenditure based rather than income based. So obviously, you can sort of move between income and expenditure data, but there isn't quite all of the different things. So I think some of the income based data and some of the other things that might be, you can sort of piece together things around different households with different incomes and then map on housing tenure and things, but I think you then struggle with the place dimensions, so trying to get all the different bits of information. I think a lot of the data probably does exist in raw form, but not necessarily put together in ways that would be helpful. And a lot of it is real-time data as well. So you're thinking about how would you most effectively support households with energy bills? Which households do you really need to target the most? That kind of real-time data, I think, is not available. So I have to confess, I'm not the statistics person in the team, but I will go back and ask them because it's an important one. Examples from abroad, well, lots of good examples. I mean, there's I went to a conference in Vienna recently. I mean, Vienna's the kind of the cliche in terms of public transport, social housing. I mean, Austria has its problems clearly, politically and in other things, but there are plenty of good examples like that where you actually, something like social housing, public transport is taken for granted. These that you don't have to make the case for them. They are absolutely seen as critical, and people expect to have good public transport and good quality social housing. So I think, in a sense, things that we kind of, in a sense, you have to be a little bit apologetic for, and things that have a different status. So I think that would be one example where, and I think at community level, there's things happening everywhere at community level. That's one of the, interesting things. There's so much of it, but that learning and scaling is the difficult part.
Right, so we have a question here, and I've got just a couple more minutes, so we need to decide if we want to ask a question. Very soon, okay, right.
So basically I have a business idea around livability and role of digitalization maybe in this particular sphere. Like I think there is, well, I'm just going to ask you whether you think the same. There is a massive gap between the advocacy market and also project development and livability, foundational economy market. So do you think actually bridging those two together to create some space, digital or can be physical as well, to bring all the actors like civil society, local governments, also businesses, etc., citizens, yield in something that can reshape the ecosystem around growth and change the narrative of growth? What do you think?
Yeah, I think digital is a huge resource because, in Wales is it's not a big country, but it's got mountains in the middle and dreadful public transport. It has something like 6 hours to go from North Wales to South Wales. And the pandemic was, the pandemic was bad in so many ways, but actually that focused people very much on the fact you don't have to drive. You can actually just go on Zoom or whatever and talk to people. So I think that was hugely liberating, the fact that we can create digital communities and you can actually get to know people who you've not met or don't see very often. So I think there's a huge potential there and making resources available. But I still think there's a very powerful thing about the human connection. I think particularly when you're talking about new things, experimentation, taking risks. People, most of us naturally don't want to do things when we're kind of worried about, is it going to work? Am I going to get into trouble? Am I going to lose my job? So actually meeting people, going to places, visiting, seeing what's happening, is really, really powerful. So I think it's how you sort of build digital communities alongside that kind of real in-person experience, because I think that's really a valuable thing.
Yes, go ahead. That would be the last question, so it's good.
Thank you for the presentation. There's a question on my head that was always on my head, and it is, are prosperity studies inherently biased? I find your research to be very objective, although it touches on being passive with the government and having the community do the work. Well, and you have the drivers of social innovation in the middle of your ladder, which could be us, and I think this could help foster a collective consciousness that can drive systemic change, but also I believe that meaningful change involves questioning fundamental assumptions about our economic and political systems, moving beyond capitalism and exploring alternatives that prioritize communal well-being and livelihood. So where do you stand? Where do you see yourself stand between either going radical about our systems or our socioeconomics, and why did you choose this approach that is just down up and
Yeah, well, I guess it's partly pragmatism, you know, in the sense if I thought there was a kind of revolutionary alternative, then I guess I'd be voting for it. But in a sense, it's a kind of recognition that things are not going to change. You know, we can vote another government in, we can wait another 5 years, we can be very disappointed. So how can we start getting on with things? You know, not to ignore the need for political change, but in a sense, assuming political change will solve the problem, I think it's really a starting point. So saying, okay, there are lots of people in communities, in these intermediaries, who know how to do things, you know, who have some of those 4 preconditions. So how do you actually get people to do things they can do? How do you get them to work with each other? You know, because in a sense, if we can't rely on the political system to solve problems, you know, we have to do things. But I'm not romantic in the sense of saying, oh, communities can solve problems, because clearly communities can't do lots of things because they don't have the power of all kinds. But I think a lot of things can be done, and maybe in doing those things, you then can make a difference to the political system around the edges. You know, there are people in politics who have, you know, do have values, I think, but, you know, since people are a little bit, some of them may be a little bit lost. So, you know, that showing people things is very, very powerful. I mean, lots of studies of kind of change management say, you know, telling people things doesn't work, showing people things. So get somebody to see something and say, okay, well, you could do more of that. That all you need to do is this. So, you know, I think, you know, everything is subjective. I mean, in a sense, we all bring our values to what we do. So I'm quite honest about that. There's no attempt at objectivity, but I think I feel I have a pragmatic sense, I think, in terms of let's get on with something.
just appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I think that's a fantastic final response. Let's get on with something, right? Let's get on with something. Okay. So the most thing we're going to do first of all is to thank Professor Froud for coming and talking to us and coming all the way from Manchester. But also just to remind all of you that the holiday party is taking place in the north cloisters of the main building now. But can you first of all join me in thanking